Hello and welcome to Inside Events, an international podcast focused on contemporary issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Professor Jane Ali Knight, who's going to be talking about leadership in the context of events. Welcome, Jane. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what organisation you work for, and why are you interested in the concept of leadership in events?
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Mike. So welcome everybody. So my name's Jane Ali Knight. I'm a professor in festival and event management at Edinburgh Napier University. So I suppose two key words there: festivals and events and Edinburgh. So obviously I'm living in the world's largest festival city, and I'm actually living this moment in the middle of the festival in the world's largest festival city. So I suppose there's an obvious interest into why I'm interested in festivals and events. Here at Edinburgh Napier, we're the largest provider of festivals education in Scotland and one of the biggest in the UK. So there's an obvious sort of interest, both in terms of teaching, research, scholarly activity, and also commercial development in terms of the work we do with industry. And then why leadership? So I think leadership is key to everything. You know, if we don't have good and effective leadership, we won't have a strong festival and events industry. And I think that's very true here in Edinburgh. I think, you know, we are the world's leader and we're led by some really inspiring leaders across the different festivals that we have in the city, and also not just those key big festivals that happen in the summer months, but also the smaller sort of voluntary community led festivals, and then obviously to, you know, the big sporting events that we've had here in Scotland as well. But I suppose from my perspective, I'm really interested in cultural festival leadership. And in particular, I've done a bit of research over the last few years looking at the role of women within leadership.
That's really useful. Thanks, Jane. And for those that are kind of unfamiliar with the detail of the concept of leadership, like how would you kind of deconstruct it just so it's like kind of really obvious for the listeners of this podcast?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, leadership, we're looking at people who lead organisations. And I think there are obviously generic leadership skills that you would have across, you know, any sector. But I think within festivals and events, there's also a certain type of leadership. So I think if we chart sort of how leadership is developed as a discipline, you know, within management predominantly, you know, it started out as very sort of autocratic and didactic and very hierarchical. Whereas I think what we're seeing now is more collaborative leadership and partnership leadership. And I think this is very true of festivals, because festivals are very collaborative entities. And, you know, the leader, although needing to exert leadership skills and qualities and traits, also needs to be able to work collaboratively, because festivals don't work in isolation. They have to work with lots of different stakeholders, suppliers, etc. So I think with leadership, we're obviously looking at how people lead organisations, how they do that both internally within their organisation, and I think maybe that's an area of leadership that's not researched as much, but also externally, because on any leader of a festival, and this is really true here in Edinburgh, you know, there's so many demands in terms of funding, you know, making the finances stack up, also working with a huge range of people and being able to foster leadership qualities within their organisation. So I think it's a really challenging time for leaders of cultural organisations at the moment. So I think that's what leadership is. And then the other side to leadership is the people that follow, you know, so that's the other thing. It's good leaders have, you know, followers who will support them and, you know, are focused on their values and the values of the organisation.
Thanks, Jane. And is there anything in particular about leadership in events that is particularly special in comparison with leading other sorts of kind of types of organization? Is there anything that we could kind of like pull out that makes you a great leader in events, would you say?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the challenges of leadership, and I think this is something a lot of the big festivals here in Edinburgh have had to deal with, is that, you know, if you're leading a cultural organisation, I suppose there's two parts of that organisation. One is the creative part, you know, and the production, you know, what you're producing in terms of whether that's art, film, theatre, whether it's multi-platform, multi-genre. But then there's also the management side of it, and you know, never the twain shall meet. You know, you have to have good creative leadership within an organisation, and you also have to have good operational leadership. Otherwise, you're not going to exist. And I think finding a person that has those two skill sets is very challenging. I mean, obviously there are some out there. So often you find that within a cultural organisation, you almost have like an artistic director and a creative leader, and then you have somebody that looks after, who's more like the chief executive or the chief operating officer who looks after that side. So I think that's different. I think we don't get that in lots of other sectors. And I think the other thing is just the way the sector works. So in terms of the fact that you're having to create this team of people really quickly. So if you think, you know, in Edinburgh, like the Edinburgh Festival Fringe has probably a core staff of 20 people, 25 people year round. And then now there's thousands of people working across that whole eco-structure that is the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, because you've got all the different venues, you've got all the people who are working here. So it's huge. So I think being able to manage that change is, you know, we don't get that in any other sector in terms of managing the staff, which is obviously a key part of being an effective leader.
And you know, all that on top of leading in the community as well. You know, thinking about an Edinburgh Fringe festival, you know, how that permeates into just the life and fabric of a place and how many people are affected. You know, we can't go into detail about that, but you know, there's just so the organogram of all the organizations and people involved in an event is just incredible, isn't it? Especially the bigger it gets. So that makes it more complex. In terms of like why we should care about the concept of leadership, I think it's, again, pretty obvious in lots of ways. But is there any kind of particular points you'd want to hammer home, Jane?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of leadership, I think that collaboration is really important. I think, you know, to be an effective leader, you have to collaborate and forge partnerships. And you have to also, within events and festivals, you have to be able to work at every level. You know, you have to be able to put out the chairs right through to meeting. You know, I was at a meeting with the UK government the other day. So, you know, you have to go from meeting the minister to putting out the chairs. So I think you have to be very flexible and you have to be very adaptable. I think that's one key thing. I think you also have the ability to lead and to inspire people, because, you know, it's a challenging time at the moment for any festival organisation, because, you know, they've got decreased funding, there's increased pressure on ticket sales, audience are, you know, so much more choosy, you know, they've got less disposable income. So I think it's really difficult. So you have to be able to inspire the people you work with, and also inspire your audience, you know, your performers, whoever it is that you're working with. So I think that ability to be flexible and adaptable. And also I think you have to be outward facing. You know, I think obviously you need to understand the operational side, but that's not your job. You're not the manager. You're not there to you have to be able to understand it and step in when they need you. But really, I see the role of a leader as being much more outward facing, much more strategic, and much more future and forward thinking. And I think that's the challenge, because of what's happened over the last few years. You know, we've had lots of challenges, like we've had Brexit, then we've had COVID, then now we've got the cost of living crisis, then we've got like things like immigration policies, which really impact on performers and visas. And so there's all these external things that are happening. And really, as the leader of the organisation, it's not your box office manager's job to understand that. It's your job to work at that strategic level. And I think that's a lot of the issues, because a lot of leaders get dragged into the operational side of delivering a festival and event, when really they need to be the advocates and the spokespeople, and they need to be out there, external facing, and doing that, environmental scanning and looking at what's going on. So I think, like, running a successful festival or event, and also all those challenges, is huge, and it takes a certain type of person. I suppose the other thing, which is even more important today, is resilience. As leaders, we need to be really resilient. We need to be able to, constantly, and thinking of people I've talked to in the sector here, that's been the biggest challenge that they've had, that they're constantly getting knocked down with various things, and the ability to keep being positive and forward thinking. So I think they're some of the key challenges that leaders have.
That's really useful, Jane. And so you mentioned that there's a lot of great leaders in your kind of neck of the woods. Is there anything like, if there was one thing that they're doing universally wrong or bad?
Bad. Oh.
Just to try and make it a bit kind of, just kind of pull out the more critical. So is there something that we just need to kind of universally do a bit better to lead better? Maybe it is the resilience thing that you just mentioned, or is there something else that, like, there's one particular thing?
Yeah, well, I think it's almost like getting distracted, isn't it? It's like, you've got this purpose as a leader, but there's all these things happening. And I think if you sort of take your eye off the main ball, which is looking to the future, and the existence of your festival and making sure it survives. I think if you get distracted by all these things that are happening, I think that's often what leaders do wrong. That they go down a rabbit hole where they get obsessed with, like, the visas or Brexit, or I don't know, like certain things that are impacting on their festival, the weather, sustainability, like all these things are important. But I always remember, like, one of our students who's like quite senior now in one of Edinburgh's key festivals, and she's like the operational manager, and she said, I don't spend my day like doing all those operational duties. I have recruited people who I trust, and I believe that they'll do it. So I don't spend my time micromanaging all these people. So I think that's maybe where sometimes things go wrong. People micromanage things, they get distracted by other things, and they take their eye off the ball. Or another thing is they take everything personally. They take things to heart, and then they make it their fight rather than the festival's fight. Yeah.
Interesting. That's really cool. Thanks, Jay. And in terms of the where the concept of leadership has come from, and where do you think it's going? Kind of, could you chart that, kind of, maybe not in too much detail, but chart kind of where it's come from, and where do you think the future trends might be for the concept of leadership?
Yeah, well, I think, thinking of the literature and stuff, I think the perspective has totally changed. I think traditionally, like, we thought of leaders as being like powerful, often having male traits, whether they were actually male. To being very, like I said before, very autocratic, very didactic. Whereas I think now it's really changed. It's more about collaboration. It's more about emotional intelligence. Being able to understand both your staff and what's happening externally. And so I think And it's all about being authentic as well. I think that's another thing. People talk a lot now about authentic leadership. And we can see that, can't we, in politics? That there's very little authentic leadership, and this is why people don't trust, a lot of politicians. So I think that sort of idea of being authentic, being collaborative, is quite a new concept. In the past, leaders were people who, would be very powerful. They wouldn't, discuss things with people. They just go on and make decisions. And I think there's an element of that. You have to do that, particularly if you're in a crisis. In a crisis situation, then obviously you have to become more autocratic and more decisions focused. So I think that's, to me, is the biggest change, is this idea of being an authentic leader, having some sort of emotional intelligence about your organisation and the sector.
But by authentic, is there an example? Have you got, because like authenticity, I can imagine being like wildly different between kind of a UK event or a Chinese event or a kind of or Jamaican event or wherever. Is there a kind of an example of an authentic sort of style of leadership that you could mention?
Yeah, well, I think, I suppose it's in terms of your values and the values of your organisation, upholding that. And, we've had a thing in Edinburgh where just now, like, Greta Thunberg has pulled out of one of the Edinburgh International Festival events. It was a joint event with International Festival, the Book Festival. And she's pulled out because she said the sponsor of that event is greenwashing. You know what I mean? So I think that's a really good example. So if we're being authentic, I actually think that was all misinterpreted. She didn't get it right. But, if we're authentic leaders, then, we have to make sure that what we deliver aligns with the values of our organisation. So, if we are trying to deliver a sustainable event, we're not, being sponsored by Shell. If we're doing some sort of political thing, we're really conscious of, who we invite to the event and stuff. So I think it starts from, what are your values as a leader? What are the values of your organisation? And making sure that everything, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? But everything is aligned to that. Like, your programme is aligned to that. Because if it's not, the press are going to hound you for it and hammer you for it. And that's what we've seen with the sort of Greta Thunberg thing. And then it's going to be the same across your staff, across your sponsors, So, a Bailey Gifford, who are the sponsor, are they going to carry on sponsoring the arts? Because it's been a massive headache for them now. But we need them to sponsor the arts. They're the sort of organisations we do. I mean, they're not an oil company, they're a finance company. So I think all this leads back to, that challenge of trying to be authentic and true to yourself and true to the values of your organisation.
Yeah. That's really good. Yeah, thanks, Jane. Just because I can imagine a student might go, well, actually, what do we mean by authenticity? Is it just me being myself, me being my real self as a leader, or is it about more of an organisational kind of?
I think it's a bit of both. I think you can't obviously impose all your values on your organisation because they might not align. But you would hope that you wouldn't work for an organisation who you don't respect their values. So it's a chicken and egg, isn't it? But I think, like, to me, the leaders that I see that are really successful leaders, like here in Edinburgh, are people who are authentic, and it is really challenging, if a sponsor's going to give you loads of money and you need money, then, there's a really difficult decision. So, so I suppose, and inclusive leadership's the thing, isn't it? It's like being inclusive, being as inclusive as you can, and that's a real challenge here. I just read something today, £20 buy you in the fringe, so it's really hard being inclusive and making everything accessible, but that's another big challenge, isn't it, of leadership.
And isn't there always like necessary evils when you're leading, like it would be great if you could align perfectly to your
Yeah.
ideals, but sometimes these things are huge. They have huge budgets, huge financial obligations. Sometimes you just have to bite and go, well, that sponsor's going to give me X. Hopefully it's not going to jar too much. There are always these necessary evils that people have to come up against. Right?
I think there has to be an element of realism as well.
Yeah.
There has to be an element of realism, but as well, you have to make sure that the planets align. And I think again, that's a good leader will do that. They'll make that happen.
That's great. Thanks, Jane. I was going to ask you about some kind of future further resources, but I'll drop you an email and we'll add those underneath the podcast because we're running out of time. But thank you so much for being on Inside Events. It's always a pleasure to chat about this, such an important topic as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Take care.